I always like to start with a story. I was at a church in Waco, and they told me this story. They said, we have this young lady who's been coming to our church and on Wednesday morning for Bible study from the community college. They were very impressed with the young lady. So all the ladies of the church finally got together because they noticed she was riding on the bus, and they thought she should have a vehicle. So they got together, pulled their money, spent $25 on a used vehicle. The next Wednesday, when she came to Bible study, she was riding the bus. And they said to her, "What happened to your vehicle?" And she said, "Well, my boyfriend had never had a motorcycle, so we sold the vehicle to buy the motorcycle." They were furious. And I said to them, if I had been the young lady, I would have done exactly the same thing. And they said, "You can't be serious." And I said, "Yes, I am." I said, first of all, the young lady understood two things. Number one, she didn't have the resources for the vehicle. And number two, there were a set of hidden rules she was following you didn't know. Take a minute and talk with your neighbor at the table. What resources does a vehicle take? Take a minute and talk with your neighbor. To have a vehicle, what kind of resources do you have to have? Right. Vehicles are a lot like children, you know. You have to feed them, you have to insure them, you have to shoe them, you know. They take a lot of resources. So I said she understood that. And number two, she understood a set of hidden rules you didn't know. And one of the hidden rules in generational poverty is that you have to share your money, your vehicles, and she knew that would create an even bigger problem for her. So she gave you the reasoning that she thought you would understand. She did it for a relationship. You see, one of the issues in America right now is this very simple equation. It's part of what the healthcare debate was about. How do you help the resourced how do you help the under-resourced without destroying the resourced? And it's a huge debate. And what we've done basically is this. Historically, we've given resources, but we haven't given human capacity. And when you give resources without human capacity, then within 3 generations, you create a group of people who are no longer able to develop their own resources. And one of the things I love about Goodwill, and what you heard this morning, is simply this. They do it both. They give both the resources and the capacity, because that will allow you to then transition. So I'm going to back up and say just a couple things about what makes a community sustainable, why Goodwill participates in that so well, some of the issues as you make communities thriving and not feral. There's a gentleman out of the Institute for the Human Future in California, Safro, and he says this, that in 20 years from now, communities will either be feral or they'll be thriving. By feral, he means they'll be domesticated and go back to the wild. And what I'm going to say to you is that what keeps that from happening is when you provide both resources and capacity. There are 3 things that actually transition you out of poverty and middle class, and they are these 3 things. Relationships with people different than you, which is social bridging capital. The second one is education, and the third one is employment. You see, one of the things is when you meet people different than you are, you get new ideas. The problem is that their hidden rules interfere with that ability to make a relationship. Hidden rules are unspoken cueing mechanisms that people use to let you know you do or don't belong. And the way you know you broke a set of hidden rules is the way people look at you. They never say anything to you, you know, they look at you like you look at something moving in a wastebasket, you know. But they don't say anything. How many of you have been to a new church and stood up at the wrong time? Yeah, well, you broke a set of hidden rules. Well, we are very comfortable with the fact that we have them by race. We're very comfortable we have them by religion. We know we have them by region of the country, but we don't think we have them by economic class and resource basis, and actually we do. I know a wealthy gentleman in Corpus Christi where I live, and he said this to me the other day. "Ruby, we only played golf with that guy one time." He said, "Because you know why? He didn't know the rules." He didn't mean he didn't know the rules of golf. He meant he didn't know the hidden rules of the situation. Well, one of the ways you learn hidden rules is by meeting people different than you are, if they're willing to teach them to you and explain to you what happened. And I'll give you a very quick story about one hidden rule, and then I want to talk about why when you build community sustainability, those rules around people's resource bases really then often create roadblocks and barriers when they don't need to. But one of the hidden rules we have in America is hidden rules around food, and by class. Like food and poverty, very important because food's the line between being destitute and being poor. People would say we were poor growing up, but we always had enough to eat. And the issue around food and poverty is quantity, and people will say after a meal, are you full? Did you have enough? As a matter of fact, the diet in poverty is very high in carbohydrates and fats because carbohydrates help your brain make serotonin. That's why if you were on that South Beach diet for more than a week, you thought you're going to have to kill somebody, okay? Because your brain wasn't making any serotonin. Well, in middle class, the issue around food is quality, and the question after meal is, did you like it? Was it good, you know? But in wealth, the issue around food is presentation, okay? Was it artistically presented? Did it go with the theme, okay? Did it have aesthetic appeal? How many of you have gone out to eat and spent $30 on the entree, got this much food, okay? And as you were leaving the restaurant, somebody in your dinner party said, now let's go get real food, okay? You had to go buy Burger King. Well, I tell this story to make a point. I didn't know that little hidden rule about food. And when my former husband was in the Chicago Board of Trade, we were thrown in with very wealthy people. And one of them, a bond trader's wife from old money, got sick. So as I grew up fairly middle class, one of the things that happened is I took a casserole. That's what you do in middle class, you know. And I even went upscale with a Pyrex bowl, you know. Which she did not return. Broke one of my hidden rules because, you know, I had my name on the bottom of it in magic marker. And she took one look at it and she said, well, just put it in the kitchen. Well, I was upset that she was so rude, and she was upset that I was so stupid, okay? But nothing was said. And the real issue around that is that it creates this whole concept of what's intelligent. And so one of the things that happens is that you get 3 chances, and the group that has the most money or the most power or is the dominant group, they think their hidden rules are the best. And the first time you break a hidden rule, people notice and they say, well, they'll say, well, she must be having a bad day. The second time to themselves, they say, oh my, such a loss of potential there, okay? But the third time they'll say, you know, they'll tell their friends, you know, well, the wheel is turning, but the hamster's dead, okay? And so part of what happens then is when we get in the workplace environment, when we get in social settings, and when we get in community issues of sustainability, those all come to the table. And people say things like, well, I'm not going to go to that meeting again. You know what? They wasted time, you know? Or, they didn't even understand our issues. And so it becomes a huge issue as we begin to negotiate the community. Well, what a program like Goodwill does is it, through the one-on-one relationships, through the workforce experience, they really begin to help develop this understandings. One more story about this. When I first met my former husband, who grew up in extreme poverty, we were married about a year, and I wanted to buy a house. And he said, no, we're not going to buy a house. He said, because you know what? The bank owns you when you buy a house. Well, actually, in poverty, because of the way interest rates are, because of your understandings of the financials, that's often true. I said, look, my parents have had loans all their life. That's how you build an asset base. We're going to have a house. Well, we argued for a year. Well, we found one. And his mother went around, and I loved her dearly. She told everybody in the neighborhood, you know what, that house is too expensive. You know what, they're going to lose that house, and then you know what's going to happen? One of them's going to end up moving in with us, and this is a problem, okay? Well, I kept saying, no, we're not going to lose that house, because I knew that we only had about 10% indebtedness, and you could be up to 30%. Well, we bought the house. 18 months later, we sold it for 50% more than we paid for it. Well, within 2 years, they all went out and bought houses, okay? But it's an example of when you have relationships and information. Information is transferred through generations. We talk about race being a form of privilege. We talk about social access, about money, and it is, but a huge form of privilege that we never talk about is knowledge, and it's huge. I could give you the stats to prove this, but the bottom line is one of the things a program like Goodwill does is it provides that information, that knowledge base, so you can transition, so you can have capacity. When I talk about communities, I'm going to say in closing, because I know where our time frame is very tight today, but I'm going to say this about communities. Communities have in them what I call a radar. And below that radar, there are things that are happening. Paul Safro says this in his Institute for the Human Future. He says it takes 20 to 25 years to become an overnight success, okay? And what happens is this: you have this radar in your community, and things happen, and people don't know them for a long time because it takes 20 to 25 years to get critical mass. And it's when you have critical mass, 35 to 40% in social phenomena, that it gets above the radar. For example, just tell your neighbor, what year was television invented? Tell your neighbor, what year was it actually invented? What year was it? Anybody know? 1926. When did most homes get television? Yeah, early 50s. What year was internet actually invented, at the first version of internet? 1969. When did most people get it in their homes? Yeah, some people go, never. Okay. Well, the bottom line on the thing is this: it takes a long time. And what we see in communities is this, is that when the people who are under-resourced are 10% or 20%, the community is very willing to support it. When it gets to 40%, then the community is overwhelmed. And since top 10% of the community pay almost 80% of taxes, they get overwhelmed. Where we see communities in most turmoil is between 40 and 60% of being under-resourced. That's when the demands on the services start to climb: social services, law enforcement services, etc. And communities we see that are going to thrive in the future are those communities that not only provide the resources, they provide the capacity. And that's what Goodwill does. I sat on the plane the other day by an investment banker, and he said this to me: Ruby, we're becoming a country of haves and have-nots. He said, it's not possible to govern to two economies. He said, if you govern to the wealthy, the poor revolt. If you govern to the poor, the wealthy leave. And in America, what we are facing right now is how we build resources and capacity simultaneously. Our social policies for the last 50 years have been based upon the concept of social determinism. And so we have given resources without developing capacity. And eventually, that's not a sustainable system. And what Goodwill does is they provide capacity. At the same time, they provide resources. It's an incredible model, and it's one we need to use across the United States. So in closing, I'm going to leave you with a quote that I like very much. That's by a man named Joe Jaworski, who wrote the book called Synchronicity. And this is the quote, and I leave it with you today because it's so incredible that you have 750 people here today. It means that the community commitment is there. And he says this: if individuals and organizations will operate from the generative orientation, from possibility rather than resignation, we can create the future into which we are living, as opposed to merely reacting to it when we get there. Thank you very much.